This week I painted something a bit different, an old pickup truck in watercolour. And in this video I'll share some of my painting process with you. I'm here in our TV room today because we're getting some new stairs put in. We've got a joiner here who's using some power tools, and this is the furthest room away from where he's working, so I hope we don't hear him. I've got my paintings here on the coffee table in front of me. I've not painted anything like this before, so it was an interesting exercise. I painted using both wet on wet and wet on dry techniques. I did a detailed study before I painted this one so that I could work out my colours and my techniques, and then I felt confident enough to paint another one where I filmed myself. A few weeks ago when I painted some grapes, I had a question about reserving highlights. I was asked why I wet over the highlighted area with water instead of leaving that part dry. I had a grape with a little white highlighted area on it, and when I painted the grape, I wet the whole grape with water, and then I put the paint on and I tried to keep the paint off the highlighted section. I was asked why I didn't leave the highlighted section dry. I'll answer that question in this video because I did the same thing when I painted this truck. I wet the entire panel or section where the highlighted area was with water first, and then I put the paint onto the wet paper, avoiding the highlighted section. So when I get to that part, I'll explain why I do that. The reference photo was taken by a friend of mine, Diane Morin. She took the photo in southern Alberta in the US. So thank you, Diane. Diane sent me a few different photos. I chose this one because I like the way the truck is positioned on an angle, and I like that the sun is creating those interesting cast shadows on the door. I used a limited palette of only 3 Winsor & Newton colours: Winsor Violet, Burnt Sienna and French Ultramarine. And I painted it on Arches cold press watercolour paper. I start by mixing a small amount of Winsor Violet into Burnt Sienna. I want to use Burnt Sienna, but I don't want to use it at its full intensity. I decided to paint the truck panel by panel or section by section. There were highlighted areas on the truck that I wanted to include, and I thought it would be easier for me to focus on a panel at a time. So I started with the lower section of the door and I wet it with some water. And then I used the colour that I mixed. I took that about halfway across the panel, and then I painted some burnt sienna onto the right hand side. So here I'm getting burnt sienna on its own, nothing mixed with it. And I'll paint that on this side. Most of this painting was painted with a mixture of burnt sienna and Winsor Violet. I only used the colours at their full intensity in a few places on the front of the truck. Now I'll get a bit of Winsor Violet and I'll drop that in there while it's wet, just to add interest. I'll leave that to dry and I'll move on to this back wheel arch panel, I'll call it. So some water on this. This one has a sunlit spot on it, so I want to try and reserve the paper there. You see where it's the lightest section on the reference photo. I'm also going to try and keep this back section of the truck lighter than the front section so that it looks like it's further away. For this, I'll use a mixture of Winsor Violet and Burnt Sienna, and I'll keep the colour fairly pale. Looking at the reference photo, that highlight has got soft edges all the way around the outside of it. So that's why I've wet this entire panel here. I'll keep the paint off that highlight, and the paint should creep gently up to the edge of the highlight. I'll get some burnt sienna now. I'll paint this on this back section. So I'm varying the colours slightly. But you can see I'm keeping this fairly pale. Now I've gone back to the mixture, the two colours. And I'm trying to leave that white paper showing there. Hopefully it won't drift all the way in and completely cover it. I might use my brush like a sponge and take a bit more off. Here's where I want to show you why I didn't leave the highlighted area dry. That's because the highlighted area on the truck has got soft edges around its perimeter. If the highlight had hard, sharp edges around the outside of it, I would have taken the water right to the edge of the highlight and left the highlight itself dry. I'll show you what I mean now. I've drawn the wheel arch panel here on a piece of scrap watercolour paper. This time when I wet it, I won't wet the highlighted area, I'll leave that area dry. I'll just wet around it. So when you look at the paper there, you can see it's wet all around the outside edge of the highlight, but the highlight itself, where I want it to sit, is dry. So then I put the paint on while it's wet, and the paint will bleed or move with the water that's on the paper. I try to keep the paint away from the edge of the water near the highlight, just like I did on the wheel arch of the main painting. This is the burnt sienna going on now. And what's happening is the paint is creeping or moving over towards the edge of the water, and it's forming a hard line around the outside edge of my highlighted area. So here you can see it's just about dry, and you can see that it's formed hard edges around that area, as opposed to my painting where I wet the entire section with water and allowed the paint to gently creep towards that highlighted area. So when I want soft edges around my highlights, I prefer to wet the entire section, and that way I can ensure that those edges will remain soft. I've painted in a few more panels working on wet paper. Now I'll work on this panel just here. And again, I wet it with water the same way I wet all the other panels. And now I've got water all over that front section except for the headlight. Here I've got burnt sienna. I haven't mixed any of the violet with it. Now I've got a mixture of the two colours, violet and burnt sienna, but it's got a bit more of the violet in it. Still using the mixture of the two colours here. Just trying to work out where to keep the highlight. And then I painted around the headlight and around that little circle underneath. And here I've got a bit more burnt sienna on my brush, so there's no violet mixed with it, it's just burnt sienna. And here again you can see how I've got the soft edges around the outside of the white highlight. Now I want to start to get a bit of colour onto the tyres. I want the tyres to fade away at the bottom, so I'll put a bit of water there. I'm quite happy for the paint to bleed there down onto the background area. I mixed my own black from French Ultramarine and burnt sienna. I mentioned earlier that I want to make the back of the truck a bit lighter in colour than the front of the truck. At the moment everything is much the same, so I'll get this colour on here and then soon I'll start to darken the front of the truck. So this black is fairly watery, it's not very dark. You can see how it's bleeding at the bottom of the tyre there because I wet the paper or wet the background there. I can't really see what's going on the reference photo, so I thought I'd just let it melt away into the background there. I didn't want to fuss and paint in the grass around the truck. And now I'll do the same thing with this wheel at the front, or tyre at the front. I wet the tyre itself and also down onto the area underneath where the tyre sits on the ground. And that way it will bleed down into that area. So fairly light black on wet paper. Now I've dipped my brush in the water so I don't have a great deal of paint on it. It's fairly light at the bottom. After I did the tyres, I painted in the grille and I started to darken the front of the truck. So here I'm going to darken this front panel over the tyre. So again, I'm wetting the panel with water. Everything's dry, of course. And now I've got a mixture of the two colours, burnt sienna and Windsor violet, with a bit more Windsor violet in it. It's much darker and bolder now, the colour. The front of the truck is in shadow, so I need to make it darker, but I also want to make it quite dark to bring it forward. So I want it to have quite a bit of difference to the colour that I've used on the back of the truck. Where I want the colour to finish, I use my damp brush to soften that edge. Now I want to increase the colour further back, so I continue to wet the panel with water. I didn't wet it at the start because it would have dried before I got to it. You can see I've just wet over the highlight as well. So now I can increase the colour on the rest of the panel, but it won't be quite as dark as it is on the front. Here's where I've got some really rich, juicy burnt sienna straight out of the tube. I wanted to increase the colour there over the top of the tyre. And then back here I've got the mixture of the two colours again, just deepening that section there. I dried it off really well, and then I found that I needed to darken the front even further. So I re-wet the front section and I'm giving it another layer of paint. So this is its third layer at the front. That's a mixture of the two colours, burnt sienna and Windsor violet. I run my damp brush over the edge again where it meets the lighter colour. And then I did the same thing on the hood of the truck. It wasn't quite dark enough, so I re-wet it with water and I'm putting another layer of that dark colour. I wet this panel with water as well, and I've got some of the burnt sienna Windsor violet mixture, but it's got more burnt sienna in it. I need a tiny bit of Windsor violet. You can see I'm leaving that highlight along there as well. So I wet the entire panel, not just the bottom section. And that's giving me those soft edges where the highlight is. Then I needed to darken the tyres, so I wet them with water and I mixed some more black. The black was mixed from French ultramarine and burnt sienna, but it's quite a bit darker now. This tyre at the front can go quite a bit darker, but I want to fade the colour away at the bottom of the tyre, just so that it looks like it melts into the ground. So I'm painting on wet paper here. And then I can take my paint out of my brush and use my damp brush to pull that paint down a bit further. And it fades away into the lighter paint. So I'm just washing my brush out again. Get rid of those lines there, just with the wet brush. Towards the end of the painting, I knew I needed a shadow underneath to ground the truck. So I wet the front section with some water. I mixed some grey, a very cool grey, with burnt sienna and French ultramarine. And then I used that to paint in that shadow. And that helps to, as I said, ground the truck and stop it from looking like it's floating in the air. Behind this front tyre, I wanted that area to be quite dark, so I used black in there. And then as I moved down towards the ground, I've switched to the grey mixture. So it gets lighter as it goes down. Then when it dried, I could see it wasn't dark enough, so I re-wet that shadow with water. I got some more black and I gave it another layer. This time I won't use the grey. I'll just soften that edge away where the black meets the grey with my damp brush. And last thing I did, I painted some water along the bumper. And here I've got some grey paint that I mixed from burnt sienna and French ultramarine. And there it is, finished. It was fun to paint something a bit different, and I'm quite happy with the way that it turned out. I'm currently making a full-length tutorial of this painting for my Patreon site. I plan to post it on there next month. So I hope you'll join me there. If this video was helpful to you, please give it a like and be sure to subscribe. And I'll see you in my next video. I'll answer that question in this video because I did the same thing when I painted this. Looking at myself, hi. Highlighted area on the truck has got soft edges around its perimeters. Perimeter. Anything like this before. So it was an interesting exercise. I painted thought I'd be able to do it in here. Or not. No, he's still going.